Welcome to today's installment in the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Networks Liberating Webinars series. My name is Lydia XC Brown, sign name, pronouns they, them, and I am AWN's Director of Policy, Advocacy, and External Affairs. Today's program is on how to survive to thrive, forced sterilization, eugenics, and disability. As a note on access, you can access CART captioning by clicking the CC button at the bottom of the screen and selecting Show Subtitle. You can also access captioning in a separate window by clicking the link dropped into the chat. And we have an access team, including deaf interpreters, who should be visible on screen. If you have other access needs that we are not meeting, please feel free to leave a comment in our chat, and one of our team members will do our best to troubleshoot the access problem to make sure that you are able to participate in today's program. We also invite you to join our conversation on social media using our hashtag, Liberating Webinars. And you can read more information about how to engage with AWN in the chat to your right. Today's event draws largely on a report published in partnership between the National Women's Law Center and AWN, in plain language, addressing laws about forced sterilization and people with disabilities. And today I am extremely excited to introduce to you our guests. First, I'd like to introduce Cara Page. Cara is a Black queer feminist, cultural and memory worker, curator, and organizer. For the past 30 plus years, Cara has organized with Black, Indigenous, and people of color, queer, trans, lesbian, gay, bi, intersex, gender non-conforming liberation movements in the US and global South, at the intersections of racial, gender, and economic justice, reproductive justice, healing justice, and transformative justice. She is leading a new project, Changing Frequencies, a Black queer feminist-led abolitionist organizing project that designs cultural memory work to disrupt the harms and experimentation of the medical industrial complex. We amplify and honor communal stories towards organizing healing and transformative futures. Cara is one of the architects of the healing justice political strategy, envisioned by many in the US South and deeply rooted in Black feminist traditions and Southern Black radical traditions of the global South. She is co-founder and current leadership team member of the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective and former executive director of the Audre Lorde Project and former national coordinator of the Committee on Women, Population, and the Environment. Next, I am really excited to introduce Maayan Anafi, they, them, Senior Counsel for Health, Equity, and Justice at the National Women's Law Center. Maayan authored the report, Forced Sterilization of Disabled People in the United States, which reveals that 31 states and the District of Columbia, currently have laws allowing the forced sterilization of disabled people. Ma'ayan lives with their cats, Bunny and Squeak, and I sincerely hope that they will both make an appearance during today's webinar. The first question that I want to pose to both of you to open up the conversation is, what exactly is eugenics? What does eugenics have to do with disability?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you may be. I just want to first again introduce myself, Cara Page, she, her. I am here on Lenape, Canarsie land in Brooklyn, New York, by way of my ancestors in the South, Georgia, and North Carolina, and Florida. I am a light-skinned Black woman wearing a greenish blue necklace, white top and pink shirt underneath, with big green glasses, green framed glasses, a large curly afro, and a quilt behind me of purple, black, green, and orange embroidery by Mexican quilters, and some other cloth and fabric objects behind me, and flowers. I wanted pink flowers, I should say. And I wanted to, again, thank everyone for inviting me to this conversation. It is an honor to speak about eugenics any chance I can get, since it's everything to do with the colonialist continued project in this country, in this world, and is deeply rooted in capitalism, racism, ableism, and xenophobia, in ways that I feel are deeply embedded in all of the movements we are a part of, but often eugenics gets left to the side or behind. So I'll give a very traditional answer. What I like to say is eugenics was a perfect marriage, a perfect ideology, and I say perfect in quotes. Eugenics was created by Sir Francis Galton, who was a white Christian philosopher and scholar who truly believed that this was a society, he was British, a society of desirable and fit, and undesirable and unfit. And he, as a white, heterosexual man, cisgendered man, and Christian and wealthy elite, presumed to say, so those of us who are desirable and fit is based on a white, masculine, able-bodied, wealthy Christian idea of who is well, healthy, and fit, and everyone else is undesirable and unfit. Very based on this idea of sorting and categorizing whose genetic materials were worthy of being reproduced, and based on a capitalist idea that those of us that cannot reproduce labor for the wealthy elite should literally be genetically removed, because if we are not there for labor, we are seen as expendable. So that's a very traditional way, I think, to introduce eugenics in terms of the preservation of whiteness, able-bodied masculinity, heterosexuality, wealthy Christian ideals of who is better than and who should exist in society. I will also say, like I like to always mention, his ideology was married with Malthus, Thomas Malthus, another white, masculine, Christian, able-bodied, wealthy, elite person who said, people of color, women of color in particular, are reproducing too many people. And so he created this idea of population control that Indigenous and people of color communities should be controlled because they are literally killing the planet, that our fertility was assumed to be rooted in the degradation of the planet. And this is from the 18th century, but I believe Thomas Malthus's idea of population control married with eugenics basically said, those of us who are not reproducing for the wealthy elite should be genetically removed because we are seen as also taking all of the natural resources from this planet, which I will say is not true because war and militarization is what's taking from this planet. But I just want to offer that as an expansion of how eugenics and population control are deeply embedded in all of the political infrastructure of this world. I'll pass it to you, Mayan.
Thanks. So again, my name is Mayan. I use they, them pronouns. I work on health, equity, and justice at the National Women's Law Center. As a quick visual description, I'm a non-binary person of mixed ethnic background with light skin and short black hair. I have some facial hair and I'm wearing earrings, although I don't know if you can see them through the camera. I'll just add that very often the story that we're told about eugenics is that it's a thing of the past, something that was confined to this dark period in history, and now there's just this fringe minority that believes in it. But the reality is that it's very much alive, even though people don't like to use the word eugenics anymore. The truth is that it's written into our laws and our policies. It's pervasive in science and medicine, and it's really embedded in the dominant way of thinking and talking about what we consider valuable in society, who we consider valuable. It's so deeply embedded that sometimes it's hard for people to recognize it for what it is.
This is Lydia. Thank you both for sharing that, right? And I think when we talk about eugenics and we talk about the ways in which eugenics has woven its way through our contemporary history and the histories and traumas of so many of our marginalized communities, it's also important for us to name, and I know that all three of us do this regularly, that eugenics isn't simply an ideology of the past. It's not a historical artifact, but it is alive and well and thriving today. In our public health responses to COVID-19, in the recent Dobbs decision at the Supreme Court, in so many ways, systematically and down to the granular level, eugenics is a marker of everyday life for those of us at the margins. My next question for both of you, and of course, all of this builds, is a question about what exactly forced sterilization is and what forced sterilization has to do with disability. And before you answer that, I realized that in all of my careful scripts, I failed to give my scripted visual description. I'm a youngish East Asian person with short black and teal hair, glasses, and I'm wearing one of my favorite shirts today. It says, "I am not a token." And behind me is a picture that I took and used as a fake background of a beautiful glass building at dusk, graced in front with trees draped in light off-white holiday type lights. So the question for both of you is, what is forced sterilization and what does it have to do with disability?
This is Mayan speaking. To start off, sterilization is a procedure that stops you from ever getting pregnant, and it's meant to be permanent. Some people want a sterilization, and that should absolutely be an option for them. They should get to decide that. But there are also times when people get a sterilization that they don't want. So sometimes people are pressured or coerced, and sometimes people are outright forced, and the sterilization happens without their consent, without their permission. through much of the 20th century, there were sterilizations on a massive scale of disabled people, Black and brown people, poor people. States forced almost 70,000 people to be sterilized. And many people don't know that history, and many of those who do think that state-sanctioned forced sterilization ended years ago, ended decades ago. But years after eugenics was supposedly out of favor, we start seeing states passing a new kind of forced sterilization law. And that's a law that says that a judge can force a disabled person to be sterilized without their consent, supposedly for their own good. As Lydia mentioned earlier, AWN and the National Women's Law Center, where I worked, studied these laws. And we found that these laws aren't just peppered here and there. They currently exist in the majority of states. 31 states plus Washington, D.C. have laws that explicitly say that a judge can order a disabled person to be sterilized without their consent. These laws aren't relics from history. They're not laws that were passed 100 years ago. Some were actually passed as recently as 2019. Just to give you a really quick idea of how these laws work, usually a guardian or a family member wants to get a disabled person sterilized without their consent, or it could be someone else like a caseworker or a doctor. Most often that's a person with an intellectual or developmental disability. So this person, the guardian, the family member, whoever, they go to the judge and they say, I think this person doesn't have the ability to consent to sterilization, but they should be sterilized anyway. And if the judge agrees that the person doesn't have the ability to consent to sterilization, to make that decision on their own, then the decision to be sterilized is out of the disabled person's hands. It's up to the judge now. And the judge can then order a sterilization if they think it's in the person's best interests, for their own good. And so even if the person doesn't want to be sterilized, even if the person has no idea they're about to be sterilized, the judge can put that aside and say that the person needs to undergo the procedure because it's in their best interests. And these laws are really grounded in the assumption that as disabled people, we can't or we shouldn't make our own decisions about our bodies, that other people need to make those decisions for us. And we know that assumption is wrong, it's dangerous, and it's been used for years to justify the reproductive coercion of disabled people.
Thank you for breaking that down so brilliantly. I did want to just offer, yes, I did go very historical in my opening, only because the myth is that eugenics started in Germany and was only carried forth by Nazism. So I always bring that first. So I appreciate the two of you, bringing it to the contemporary date. Absolutely, sterilization and eugenics happens. I just want folks to see the arc of it and how it has been a machination of state control, colonization, slavery, and attempted genocide on our communities, especially disabled people, Black people, Indigenous people, immigrants, and refugee communities that have been contained and controlled by state. However, I think Maayan brings this important element of we are also talking about the family's complicity, that at times intercepting the right, the self-determination and autonomy for people with disabilities by coming in and saying, I think this person needs to be forcibly sterilized, brings it right to our family base to understand that some of our families, our community members, are advocating forcibly on people's behalves, creating that non-consensual reproductive coercion. So what also I think gets missed is this mythology that is only through the state, and that we're not looking at a level of participatory, community-led forced sterilization. So I did want to add, I'm working with health practitioners who are at the front lines trying to disrupt eugenic practices inside of the medical industrial complex. And what I mean by that phrase is just how we understand the racial, capitalist motivated ways the medical industry has used, especially disabled communities, people of color, queer and trans and intersex communities to sterilize and use our communities for experimentation and testing to build the medical industry, non-consensually, involuntarily, and often forced. So you have things like communities in prisons and detention centers and psychiatric hospitals being forcibly sterilized by practitioners inside of these state laws that is still perceived as, well, the doctor knows best, which is an old false mythology, right? That we are still allowing medical institutions and practitioners to actually take away our ability, our autonomy and determination to say that is our right choice to be able to say whether or not, as you said, Mayan, to choose that if we choose to be have a sterilization procedure, but not forced sterilization. So I work extensively with practitioners who are either trying to hold their peers accountable or to actually disrupt systems like the prison healthcare system, the largest healthcare system in this country, that is using forcible sterilization to this day on disabled, migrant, refugee communities under the and trans and intersex communities under the auspices of healthcare for their safety and well-being. This is a crisis, this is an abomination, and it's a continued war on our bodies that many people aren't seeing the relationship to colonization and slavery.
This is Lydia. Thank you both for naming the linkages between eugenic practices of the past and eugenic practices of the present. And building on what you said, Cara, too, one thing that I always try to name for folks when we talk about eugenics is that not only is it a myth that eugenics came out of Nazi Germany, but what not enough people realize is that Adolf Hitler expressed open admiration for the United States' policies toward Native and Indigenous people, Black people, immigrants of color, and disabled people, especially poor disabled people. Adolf Hitler exported eugenicist ideologies, policies, and practices from the United States into Nazi Germany. And here in the US, many of us like to forget that fact, to literally whitewash that fact out of our history, as though eugenics is not just historical artifact, but completely removed from our history. And in reality, the Nazi practices of eugenics drew directly out of US government state-sponsored practices, out of the dominant modalities of scientific thought and so-called progressive advocacy of the time. Now, the next question that I have for you both, and it still builds on the same conversation, is what makes eugenics as a whole, and forced sterilization in particular, inherently ableist? Now, this feels obvious to me, right? But we need to explain this, right? Why are eugenicist values and forced sterilization as a practice inherently ableist?
I can kick it off. I just want to add something to what you just said, and that is, yes, state-sponsored, but I also don't want to let philanthropists off the hook, because we're also talking about the Rockefellers and the Carnegie family foundations and the Kellogg foundations that were also participating, right, in promoting and funding eugenic ideology and practice, right, into the 20th century by hiring eugenicists, right, who are gathering data to prove that quite honestly, that there would be some people who, if they're dependent on the state for more resources, that becomes financially inefficient, right? So to understand sort of this idea of using eugenics to create a division of, well, who is going to be dependent on our society that we should just genetically remove? Then you have this category of those of us who are just seen as expendable from jump, right? People with disabilities, Black people, people of color who perceived as we will always be less than, so we should be, and Indigenous people perceived as we should always be genetically removed, right? And there's so many elements of that history that continues, that belief system that's still, as you said, is pervasive in society. But if we look more deeply into, in particular, how people with disabilities and forced sterilization and eugenics is inherently ableist, we are talking about the value of only one type of body, right? We're talking about the value of only perceiving that only one type of body can exist, and only one type of body is valuable to society. So ableism gets completely attached to capitalism and racism, in this idea of, if we're not preserving this preservation of a white body, an able body, I'll say it again, wealthy body, right? To your point, a lot of poor, disabled people were the ones who began being sterilized during the onset of some of these earlier laws, and that continues, right? Because this is very much based in this ideal that the productivity of labor to keep the capitalist machine rolling is very much attached to how eugenics is used. But I also want to tie it to this in the beginning of colonization, slavery, and genocide that still exists to this day. We could break down how that looks, what colonization looks like now, what slavery looks like now. But this perception that people with disabilities will have a predilection to be criminals, or being pathologized as being mentally ill or physically disabled, this concept or construct that disability always leads to deviance, and so, or less than, right? And always leads to being dependent on the state. So what we are facing to today, to tomorrow, and you saw it in COVID, is people being surprised at the health disparities and inequities, especially when we were hearing how they were determining who was going to get the machines for respiratory support, and literally doctors having to go down the list of, well, who's going to last longer on the machines, comes from such a racist capitalist assumption, assumption of who is valuable and who will be dependent and who will survive this to still produce for capitalism. And if we're not talking about some of the roots of that, I feel it's an absolute loss in how we're understanding the long-term effects of eugenics today and the future. And also, I just want to toss in here too, environmental and climate justice as well. This assumption of who will be the fittest idea is still so prevalent in this idea of whose bodies will survive floods, environmental devastation, and how we are perceiving still through a very ableist lens, environmental and climate justice strategies that at times are still not pushing up against this idea that people with disabilities are somehow more vulnerable, more dependent. And so literally people making decisions on whose genetic makeup will last, environmental devastation, is very much inside of this whole perception of geneticism in the field of genetics, and it is absolutely dangerous, and we need to be countering these ideals.
This is Maya, and I'll just quickly add that looking at forced sterilization specifically, ableism as well as racism have been built into it from the start. One of the most horrifying things about how forced sterilization originated was that doctors developed sterilization procedures like hysterectomies by experimenting on enslaved Black women. So that's sort of the really horrifying history of how the sterilization procedures we use today came about. And as Cara mentioned, it is no coincidence that forced sterilizations they're primarily impacting disabled people and Black and brown people. They're really grounded in those narratives that Cara mentioned and the ableist and racist beliefs that disabled people and people of color can't make good decisions about parenting, that their children or they are a burden on or a drain on society, or will get involved in crime, and that they shouldn't be having children, or they should be having fewer children. And these beliefs, and in particular the ideas that the state needs to make decisions about disabled people's bodies and parenting, continue to be used to justify the laws that allow forced sterilization today.
Thank you for addressing that. When I think about this question, how are eugenics essentially ableist and inherently ableist? I think there's no possible way to talk about eugenics without talking about ableism. It is literally impossible. And just as ableism is wrapped up deeply and intricately with every other form of oppression that exists, so too is ableism at the core of eugenicist values and beliefs. Now, Maayan, you talked a little bit about this question already. So I do want to still ask you, because I'm hoping that we can, talk about it a little bit more, dig a little bit deeper. But my next question is, in what ways does our society enforce eugenics on our lives, both for disabled people and non-disabled people, historically and at present?
This is Maayan speaking. I think the laws that I mentioned are a really good example of how forced sterilization is literally built into the legal system, written into law codes across 31 states and DC. And these laws give judges the power to impose these life-altering decisions on people. But these laws that I was talking about are only one way that forced sterilization gets enforced. And I want to go back to something that Cara mentioned earlier about ways that forced sterilization happens through the criminal system. It's not a coincidence that coercive sterilization efforts have targeted people in prisons and jails and immigration detention, where disabled people and people of color are vastly overrepresented. So just as an example, in California, women were being sterilized in prison, often without their consent, often without their knowledge, up until just a few years ago. Most of them were Black women. And here's what one of the doctors who did these sterilizations said. He said that the cost of the sterilizations is reasonable because, quote, that isn't a huge amount of money compared to what you save in welfare paying for these unwanted children as they procreate more. So this doctor wasn't even hiding the fact that the justification was in essence about eugenics. And as another example, we've seen judges in several states tell people that they would get a reduced sentence or an earlier parole if they got sterilized. And fairly recently, through what a whistleblower exposed in 2020, we saw coercive sterilizations in an immigration detention center in Georgia. And for all we know, that might just be the tip of the iceberg. I'll just add that there are also indirect ways that eugenics and forced sterilization gets enforced, because as disabled people, we're often told that we can't be good parents, that we shouldn't be able to make the decision to have children, that it's even somehow selfish of us if we want children. And these biases show up in healthcare settings. We know doctors are more likely to encourage or even pressure disabled women to have sterilizations compared with non-disabled women. And when disabled people do have children, they often have to deal with threats to their parenthood, like the very real risk that the state will take away their children, that they will lose their right as a parent because they're disabled. And you put those pressures together with the fact that many disabled people face barriers when they try to, for example, get abortions or to use non-permanent birth control. And those barriers are obviously getting drastically worse these days. So if I'm being told I shouldn't be a parent, and I'm worried I won't be able to get an abortion if I get pregnant, and my access to birth control is being threatened, that might make me feel like sterilization is my only real option. And that's not a meaningful choice, but that's the reality for a lot of disabled people right now.
This is brilliant what you said, Mayan. I don't have too much more to add. I just want to offer, and I know we're about to hopefully get into some of the organizing, the strategic visioning of so many communities that are fighting all of these things. But I do want to offer this sense of this idea of the consumerist eugenics that's very prevalent in this century and the last one, where people are taking upon themselves, right, to enforce, to do forced sterilization or to suggest it. And one example is Project Prevention, formerly known as CRAC, Children Requiring a Caring Community. And essentially, Barbara Harris, the founder of that, a white woman, organizer of Project Prevention, who took it upon herself to target sex workers, predominantly Black and Latinx sex workers, to sterilize them, basically saying, in exchange for you not having children, I will pay for you to get tubal ligations, one type of sterilization. And to Mayan's point, some of those women choosing to go through the procedure because the choice, they didn't feel they had a choice because they were offering monetary incentives and money was necessary for some of them for their survival and livelihood, but they were shamed and punitively being asked to do this, not instead of being given support on how do you live safely and powerfully in thriving in an alternative economy. Instead of shaming and blaming sex workers, how are we looking at a much larger picture of elevating how you safely make the choices you need to make to survive and build an alternative economy? And Project Prevention is prevalent still in this country. It has multiple chapters and continues to exist. And I think we're going to be seeing more of these consumerist eugenics, basically community-led eugenics ideas. I mean, we could certainly tie it to the rampant increased white supremacy attacks that have been happening on different communities and how that shows up. And I am including white doctors in prisons as well, who are being very forthright about their white supremacist, eugenic, ableist, racist ideas.
This is Lydia. That's not even to get into the ways in which our government and our leaders are continuing to exacerbate and to perpetuate ableist, racist, and other dangerous ideologies around disease, labor, our climate crisis, and so many other ways in which our lives are upended by turmoil and the death machines of capitalism and white supremacy, laying the blame at our feet always. Now, Cara, you started to talk a little bit about this in your remarks just now, talking about Project Prevention, but I'd love for both of you to share a little bit about what each of you are doing individually in the fight against eugenicist practices and what other movement spaces and organizations are doing.
Do you want me to take this, or do you want to take? I've lost track. Maya, if you want to go first. Go for it.
Sure. Either way is fine for me. So yeah, this is my the report that we did on forced sterilization was really just the first step. So many people just didn't know that forced sterilization laws still existed, and we needed to get that information out. But right now we're working with state legislators on changing those forced sterilization laws and replacing them with laws that recognize that disabled people have the right to make decisions about their bodies and being sterilized, laws that make sure that everyone has the tools and supports they need to make decisions about sterilization. And that includes making sure that disabled people who want a sterilization can get access to it, as well as that no one is sterilized without their consent or without their full permission. I think it's really important as we're thinking about solutions to keep in mind that the legal system has, and I say this as a lawyer, the legal system has failed disabled people and people of color so many times. So the work we're doing on changing legislation really has to come along with changing narratives, the narratives that have been used to justify or ignore forced sterilization. We need to challenge the idea that disabled people, that we don't, or we shouldn't control our bodies, and that laws forcing us to be sterilized are somehow necessary or even compassionate. And we need to challenge the assumption that disabled people, that we can't make our own decisions, that we can't understand our bodies. Those are just sort of the initial steps that we're taking. I'll turn it over to Cara.
Yes, yes, and yes. Thank you so much. I just want to, I want to mention a few projects, but yes, I am deeply involved in a few collaborations, political collaborations with organizers, cultural workers, and academic scholars. And essentially, my work has been deeply rooted as a reproductive justice, queer, trans, liberation organizer fighting against capitalism and racism and colonization, is to understand the implications of practice, in particular by community, how we interrupt community-led practices of eugenics and ideologies. Yes, I'm definitely working against the state, always and forever. But essentially, I am deeply interested in how we are showing up for the interventions that need to be on the ground with our own communities, that are taking us away from our, that are allowing these ideals, these values, these cultural values and iconographies to continue. So one project I'm working with is the Healing Histories Project, co-led by Susan Raffo and I, with a team of amazing community historians, archivists, and organizers, to think about the implications of the medical industrial complex and its eugenic practices. So how has medicine, scientific experimentation, as you said, Mayan, on formerly enslaved Black women, the curative models imposed on disabled communities, on Indigenous communities being attempted genocide through smallpox and forced sterilization, like these different ways science and medicine has been used to destroy, right? And it doesn't have to be, right? There can be science and medicine that's used for mutual integrity, to honor the lineages of science and medicine as traditional to many of our communities, for collective survival. But there are also the ways colonizers and war and attempted genocide have used science and medicine to extract, to exploit, and to kill our communities. And we are sitting at the precipice of something, right? Because we are experiencing a global pandemic, and in all of the ableist, racist notions that came emerging out of that, Also, at the height of fascism and anti-Black racism, what we had to understand is where are we building our shared memory? Because Healing Histories Project believes that the disconnection from our memory of remembering how eugenics has deeply been embedded in many of our cultural stories and communal stories, if we're not starting to see the intersections of, for instance, immigration laws and how they have been deeply woven through a eugenic frame, or the different Indigenous acts controlling land, controlling body of tribal nations has been deeply embedded. And as we know, these forced sterilization, eugenic laws that have implicitly and explicitly allowed for forced sterilization for decades of people with disabilities. It's like, how do we not only hold institutions accountable, but how do we also remember how we have been impacted by them, how we are healing from the generational trauma from these stories and these actions literally against our bodies and communities, and how are we going to transform this trauma into building power and actions that intercept future ways that people will continue to use these eugenic practices. So Healing Histories Project is about, it is some of the work that we're doing around that, using history, memory, storytelling to understand how eugenics has impacted our lives. And I am also a founder of my other political project, Changing Frequencies, doing cultural work, partnering with different artists. And some of my work has included partnering with Sins Invalid, an amazing, as many of us know, disability justice performance troupe based in San Francisco, and continues to promote a powerful I would say doctrine of disability justice, but also performance that is rooted in countering eugenic ideas through looking at eroticism, looking at the power to birth as disabled people, looking at the power of creating family, being, interrupting this idea of not being able to be erotic and sexual as disabled people. They are shaking up all the mythologies of how we are living with our many disabilities in our lives, and how we are building how we can build an interdependence with abled people if it is rooted in a disability justice lens that allows us to disrupt these ideas of who's dependent on who, or who is not. How are we not looking out for each other? That ableism is not just about people with disabilities experiencing ableism. We are all experiencing ableism if we are allowing ourselves to participate in the mythology of whose bodies are valuable or fit or unfit. If we continue to perpetuate these ideas, it deeply alters all of our capacities to live fully in our collective bodies. So Changing Frequencies, we do different cultural installations to imagine ways to disrupt these narratives. And some of my work with Sins Invalid has taught me deeply about that, rooted in a disability justice lens. One other thing I want to add is I am part of the Shutdown Irwin campaign, partnering with Project South, moving with health practitioners, again, who are abolitionists on the front line, fighting against things like forced sterilization in prisons and detention centers. And so I am building with health practitioners. I myself am not a doctor or a nurse. I am a healer. But I truly believe if we are not moving in formation together to think about ways to care for our communities that is not rooted in an ableist, racist idea of healthy, we have the potential to build much more powerful structures of care that do not rely on state concepts of eugenics and capitalism.
This is Lydia. Thank you so much for sharing that, Cara and Mayan. Your work both blows me away sometimes. And I mean that as someone who's, I like to think that we are comrades in a struggle, in very connected struggles. You know, there are people who are here now who may be wondering what they can do to learn more and become involved in supporting and leading this work in their own communities. What resources or ideas would you offer?
Well, I do want to jump in here and say how I met Lydia XZ Brown is by way of the Anti-Eugenics Project. So I forgot to mention that as well, which is a rumbling, emergent formation, gritty formation of organizers, scholars, and cultural workers, not that you can't be all one and the same, that really attempted to center a disability justice lens inside of a 10-day virtual convening on the role of eugenics in our lives, and what are the possibility of what's the possibility for our futures, for our collective care and safety and building power to dismantle these constructs and institutions of eugenics. We looked at holding philanthropists accountable. We looked at holding museums accountable. We looked at holding hospitals and prisons and detention centers accountable for the ways they were perpetuating eugenics. And I do think it will take this kind of cross-disciplinary, action-oriented strategies to really shake up and disrupt what decades and decades of capitalist genocide has created that's deeply embedded in eugenic ideas. So I do think that it must center disability justice. So yes, plug into the Anti-Eugenics Project, which again, it's emergent, trying to find its way on how to build, I would say, strategic conversations and collaborations across disciplines, movement, academia, science. What are ways we're trying to work together to build ideas with each other? And then certainly please get involved with the Shutdown Irwin campaign. You can go to, I think, the pound sign Shutdown Irwin. There will be more actions against forced sterilization in prisons. And I think we are on, again, the precipice of something. So please come and join the coalition and see what's possible. We're still building strategy. And Healing Histories Project is deeply involved, as I mentioned, in building storytelling and cultural memory. So if you're interested more in the sort of story of how are we disrupting eugenics in the medical industrial complex, please reach us there as we're trying to build more work around that with community.
I'll just add that I think one of the roots of the problem that we're dealing with is that so few people are aware of how eugenics and forced sterilization plays out today. And so if you want to get involved, one really key thing to do is to share the projects that Cara was talking about, share the report, share information with your family and friends, and try to help change the narrative, because the silence around forced sterilization makes it even harder for people who have faced forced sterilization, for people who have faced eugenics, people who continue to face it, to speak up and share their stories. There are already so many barriers to doing that. And if you're interested in changing the laws in your state, definitely you can contact me, or if you're just interested in sharing your own experiences, absolutely contact me. I can put my email in the chat. There's a lot of opportunity to build on this work together.
This is Lydia. Thank you for sharing those resources, and we will make sure that those go out to everybody who is here today. For folks who are participating, if you have a question for Cara or Mayan, now is your chance to ask that question if you want to post it into the chat box. But in the meantime, while we are waiting to see if anyone does have questions they want to pose to you, I have one last question for you both. And that question is, what gives you hope for a future past eugenics?
This is Mayan. So there was a lot of outrage in response to the report. Many people just had no idea these laws were so widespread. And so I think there's a lot of energy to change these laws. And I think people are rethinking other kinds of coercion, like guardianship systems, which is also used to take away reproductive decisions away from disabled people. So we're starting to see some movement for change. I mean, I'll be real, sometimes it does feel kind of like screaming into a void. And there's a lot of people who think that forced sterilization of disabled people and eugenics more broadly is justified, even if they won't use the word eugenics to say so. But I think that there are a lot of kernels of change.
I have so many thoughts about this. I am incredibly hopeful because I do think, Mayan, I think you're right. I think this is right on time. I think this report reveals so much truth telling. And that's so, I imagine so many people were surprised or shocked. And with that energy, how do we build power and disrupt? And I do think it is a particular moment to see the reproductive justice movement. For many of you who may not know what that is, it is Black, Indigenous, and women of color and trans of color led movement to really center ways we want to build our families, ways we want to birth, ways we want to reproduce that is not defined by eugenics, population control, or state ideas of reproduction, or private ideas of reproduction. And I do embrace these organizations such as California Latinas for Reproductive Justice, who were a part of moving the reparations bill to give some reparations to the more than 60,000, at minimum 60,000 Indigenous and women of color, especially Latinx women who were sterilized in California prisons. And we know this is but one story of so many that we are starting to see survivors to have the courage to name their experiences, to see the level in North Carolina of many people fighting for reparations in that state, many people with disabilities who had to tell their truth and risk their, I would say, their lives in saying, this happened to me, we're talking 3 generations in North Carolina of people with disabilities that were sterilized, forcibly sterilized. And then please include experimentation and testing that has been prominent on Black and Indigenous incarcerated and queer and trans people under the guise of eugenics. So we are, or to see the Intersex Justice Project fight against the medicalization and experimentation on youth of color who are intersex. There is such energy and commitment and power building to understand how these things are very much moving in relationship to each other towards disrupting eugenics and dismantling eugenics. And I truly believe we are in the wake of more diseases, we are going to need to fight for our survival as disabled people. And so where do we, there is no line to draw here. How and where are we all positioned to move in formation together? I believe eugenics is deeply centered in all of our movements, whether it's land, our people, our genetic materials, our traditions of survival and care. These are inseparable from each other, and cross movement, cross disciplinary organizing is happening.
This is Lydia. Again, I want to thank everyone so much for joining us today for this discussion. A huge and enormous thank you to Cara and Mayan for sharing your time, your labor, and your wisdom with us. A thank you to our interpreting team, making language access possible, our CART captioner, and to AWN's team, represented today with Nancy, Sharon, Ellis, and Kate. We are so grateful for all of you, and for you, our beloved community members. We hope that you will join us for our next program, which is tomorrow evening at 7 Eastern and 4 Pacific, addressing organizing across disability, gender, and queerness. We'll be joined by guests Jamila Hamami, Jamila, Hammami, and Bridget Liang, Bridget Liang, in partnership with the Curve Foundation and Beyond the Curve. Thank you again for your time today, and hope to see you tomorrow. See you in the struggle.